Hi everyone, welcome to today's show. Very interesting show today, very revealing. I brought on a chap called Alex. Alex has got a very interesting story to tell you about working in the civil service and how it led to what he found out behind the scenes with COVID and also some of the other stuff he's seen regarding wokeness and the overreach of that as well. So, Alex, thanks for joining the show. Would you mind just giving us a little brief background then into your story?
Yeah, so the first thing is to say is I work for the civil service, that is government for the government between 2018 and 2022. In that time, I was employed by two different government departments. First of all, for DEFRA, that's the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, and then on that, I worked a lot on Brexit preparedness to ensure that the UK Britain was ready for EU exit in terms of the statute book, in terms of our laws were ready. And then for DHSC, so I joined DHSC in 2020, that's the Department for Health and Social Care. And at DHSC, I was involved in a similar role as at DEFRA, and I was involved in project managing the delivery, the coordination delivery of primarily COVID regulations, rules, but also other stuff. But the reason why it was hard at that time is because that government department was very, very busy because the COVID pandemic had taken off and there was a lot of work to be done. And really today I'm going to give you an insight into some of what I saw, some of what I experienced. And let me just say that I very quickly, within a month or so after joining DHSC, realized that I was incredibly uncomfortable, incredibly unhappy there, because I was essentially working, and although all civil servants have to be impartial and neutral in their delivery, and I was always professional, I was always neutral, impartial. I was personally conflicted because I knew that what the government was doing in terms of lockdowns, um, in terms of the restrictions on movement, on restrictions on freedoms, and later, of course, the COVID vaccines was a complete overreach of the state, and to quite an unprecedented level, certainly within peacetime. So let me just go into, because I want to clarify, I was working within my title at DHSC was, my job title was Deputy Head of Legislation. So I was within the team that was, again, supporting and coordinating the making of departmental legislation. So just to very briefly summarize, I'm not going to go and do a lecture in public and administrative law, but acts of government, which is primary legislation, create powers for ministers within government departments to make what's known as secondary legislation or delegated legislation. That's regulations or statutory instruments. So the minister within each, or the Secretary of State and junior ministers within each government department, have the power to make regulations that's delegated to them by an act of parliament. And that's primarily, although I also did some work around primary legislation, but that's primarily what I was working on. And primarily at DHSC, that was on relating to the COVID regulations, the regulations that put us into lockdown, put us into, which is essentially a loose term, but essentially if you probably remember the local restrictions that then became the tier system. We had a series of tiers, tier one, tier two, and the restrictions of movement between those tiers, and what people could and could not do within those tiers. Then also the penalties, the PPE legislation that required everyone to wear masks, and social distancing, as it was called, or unsocial distancing, really, because it was really antisocial. And then, of course, the COVID regulations. And what I want to clarify is that I am not a qualified doctor at all. I'm not someone who can. I have my own views. I've done my own research, but I can't comment from a position of authority on, was lockdown the right thing to do? Was, a COVID vaccines efficient or not? Or are they counterproductive? Again, I've done my own reading. I have countless. I have a friend of mine who was 25 years old, who had Crohn's disease but was otherwise healthy, and he had the AstraZeneca jab, the vaccine, and then died within 24 hours of a cerebral hemorrhage. So I have, like many people, my own personal stories, my own experiences, and I have done my own reading, but I'm not in a position to comment on the medical side. Where I am in a position to comment is on how the legislative process, that is the lawmaking process that was followed by the government department in making those COVID rules, was used to essentially bypass parliamentary scrutiny altogether. That means that our elected representatives, our MPs, were not given the chance to review these and really object to these COVID rules before they came into force. And I'm going to go into the technicality of that a little bit. So essentially, you may remember there was a COVID Act, in 2020. So that was, again, primary legislation that wasn't really used in terms of the lockdowns. It had a very limited scope, in fact. That piece of legislation was only really used in terms of things like changing court proceedings, for example, so that court proceedings that were previously held in person would be held online, for example. The legislation that was used to make 99, probably 100% of the COVID rules was a piece of legislation, primary legislation, called the the Public Health Prevention of Diseases Act 1984. And the reason why that legislation was used, and they could have used, for example, the Civil Contingencies Act 2004, but the reason why they used the 1984 Act is because the powers, again, the powers delegated to ministers to make regulations. Remember, I said that the primary legislation gives government departments, gives ministers and government departments the powers to make departmental regulation, secretary legislation. The particular powers in that act allowed for a particular procedure to be used, informally known as the emergency procedure, and more formally as the made affirmative procedure. But what this effectively meant was that a minister could sign into effect a statutory instrument, regulations that say creating new restrictions, say, I don't know, the mask mandate or whatever it might be. And that would then come into effect almost immediately. So it would still have to be debated in Parliament after 30 days. Within 30 days, but Parliament, they could wait for a month before this was debated. So it would come into force straight away without Parliament having any, even having without MPs even having the opportunity to review it at all. So this was done in order because it was deemed that there was a public health emergency. So you had the COVID committee, which was a temporary cabinet subcommittee. We had the Prime Minister and certain senior, obviously the Secretary of State for Health and Chief Medical Officer Chris Whitty and the Chief Scientific Officer Jonathan Van Tam and others, and they would make decisions saying, "Well, we need to do this urgently because there's a public health crisis, and literally people are going to die." And so then there was a huge rush, and we would be basically instructed, we need to do this like now, within, in some cases, sort of 12 hours, 24 hours for this legislation to come into force tomorrow. That was the kind of level of pressure on our team. We had to be extremely organized and well prepared and know exactly what we're doing, because essentially we were coordinating. My job was to coordinate between the policy officials making the policy and the lawyers and the parliamentary officers and others. And so there's a huge amount of pressure to get this all done. But obviously, because of that, time wasn't given to parliamentary officials to be able to scrutinize, to look at, review what was going to. So there's no democratic oversight, really. That's the point. And I'm going to stress as well that with delegated legislation or secondary legislation, 80 to 90% of it is never debated in Parliament anyway, because it's made under another process called a negative process. Again, this is a technical term, but essentially it means that that those regulations are laid in Parliament and then become law after 21 days, and then, but at least there's that 20. In fact, there's a 40-day period in which MPs can object to it. They can, table it's a prayer motion, a motion for annulment, which can be, and although this is very, very rare that happens, that at least that is there. At least they have the time to review that legislation that's being made.
So which regulations were forced in then, exactly?
Well, there were lots of them. I mean, there were hundreds of them, I think. You had, as I said, they applied this emergency procedure to all the COVID rules. So this must have been like hundreds of regulations. And I
So
think
you were making them. You were creating them yourself, or was it coming from someone else, and you were being told to,
no, I wasn't. I know I was coordinating the process. So I was basically. So if you think about a machine has lots of different parts, lots of cogs in the machine, if you like. And I was I was holding it all together. So I was the person sort of coordinating. So I was putting, the policy team, the policy officials and the civil servants are responsible for coming up with policy ideas for legislation.
So who gave it? Who gave you these ideas then exactly?
Sorry?
Who would have given you, so let's just take an example, right? You have to wear a mask was one, wasn't it? Like if you're in a social environment or even going outdoors, which is mad, but who gave you that?
Well, again, these were decisions that were being made by the COVID committee. So they were advice was being given to the ministers by So, but to the COVID committee specifically, and again, I said, this was a temporary cabinet office committee that was set up at the time. So the prime minister and the Secretary of State for Health, and they would make a decision at the committee. But the advice was coming from again the chief scientific advisor, the chief medical officer, and they're the people behind them advising them, right?
Who's behind them? Was it the WHO?
Well, what I will tell you is that the if you look at the one of DHSC's agencies is the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency.
Mm.
So they're the agency. So each government department has agencies working. So they're the agency that's meant to regulate medicines and medical products. And that would include vaccines.
Mm.
So they are funded, I think 80% funded, or so, I don't have the exact figure to fund, but they're like 80% funded by Gavi, which was a international vaccine, which is in turn funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Well, it's
So
not just funded, it is Bill Gates's whole
yes,
company, right?
yes.
Yeah.
So the point is that there's a huge conflict of interest because
Yeah.
people, right? So often the same broader industry lobbying for greater vaccinations is the same, and funding the regulator is the same industry that's been regulated by that
Mm.
regulator. So there's a huge conflict of interest there.
Well, not just that, but the elected Director General of the World Health Organization was Tedros Ghebreyesus, right? Who was a former Gavi board member.
Mm. Yes, so that's the other problem. There's the revolving door,
Yeah.
as it's known. There's the revolving door between politicians and industry. And you can give Jonathan Dantamp, who's the chief scientific officer, he then landed a job with Pfizer afterwards.
Mm.
So again, case in point, there's that revolving door between like government and more specifically the regulators and the people making medical decisions and the organizations that they're governing. And how can you have accountability there
Mm.
when it's not even the same organizations and the same individuals working for those different organizations, and they go from one to the other.
Tell me what you think of this, because I actually asked ChatGPT about COVID and the potential conflict of interest. So this is my ChatGPT entry. I said, well, if Bill Gates has his own vaccine program and wants to sell it, he can affect policies at the civil servant level, influence them through his own think tanks and foundations, and basically get them to create the consensus that would create the public opinion perception to then buy into his vaccine programs slash agendas. No? And ChatGPT said, yes, in broad strokes, that's a realistic assessment of how influence works in the current system, especially in areas like global health. Let's spell it out. If someone like Bill Gates wanted to push a vaccine program, here's how it can realistically play out without needing to control governments directly. One, fund research and institutions. Fund key universities, research labs, and public health NGOs that study and develop vaccines. Fund global health bodies, e.g. Gavi, World Health Organization, that promote vaccination globally. Fund regulatory advisors or give grants to agencies like the MHRA in the UK. Number two, shape the expert consensus. These funded entities publish studies, models, and projections. These become the evidence base for policy decisions used by civil servants and scientific advisory committees, e.g. SAGE. Civil servants, often risk averse and reliant on the science, follow that consensus. Number three, influence policy via think tanks and advisory bodies. Fund or partner with think tanks like Chatham House to promote the policy as a global best practice. These think tanks provide briefings and talking points used by ministers and departments. 4. Leverage global institutions. Use global power via the WHO, Gavi, and World Economic Forum to standardize approaches, e.g., digital vaccine passports, emergency procurement. UK civil servants align UK policy with these global norms to maintain international credibility. 5. Media and narrative framing. Fund the media training organisations like the BBC, Media Action, or collaborate with outlets for public messaging. Shape the public conversation around health, risk, and social responsibility, nudging acceptance. Result? You don't need to bribe anyone or issue orders. Instead, you create a closed feedback loop, which is fund the research, influence the data, present it as the science, guide civil servants via expert briefings, roll it out through government messaging, frame dissent as anti-science or anti-vax or conspiratorial, all under the guise of public good and neutral expertise, even though you're financially invested in the outcome. And yes, that's dangerous because there's no public oversight. Civil servants and politicians may not even be aware of the deeper influence. It blurs the line between philanthropy, business, and governance, and it sets a precedent where private billionaires can shape global policy through unelected indirect influence. This isn't theoretical. Investigations by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the BMJ, and Open Democracy have already exposed parts of this exact machinery. I thought that was kind of a nice
Well, there you go.
ChatGPT smashed it. Normally ChatGPT is a bit woke, but
It is, isn't it? I want to say some more broader words about the civil service and my observations and my impressions from working there. And what I would say is that the civil service, again, they're bound by the Civil Service Code, which means that they're meant to be impartial, they're meant to have integrity and honesty, and they are meant to abide by these ethical codes. But the problem is that many of the, I would say, and it's very difficult to put a number or even to quantify this at all, but I would say that a majority of civil servants, and what we're particularly concerned with within the civil service, is policy officials, because these are the people who come up with government policy, who come up with the detailed government policy, because the government may have its manifesto and it may have its broader objectives, and indeed it may fail to deliver on those and change its mind constantly. But there's a lot of detailed policy that needs to be made on very, very specific matters. And as they say, the devil is often in the detail. Now, civil servants, as I said, they tend to be left-wing. They tend to be people who, and it makes sense if you think about it, because the people who would join the government, who would work for the government, are going to be people who ideologically believe in the government and believe in the government as a force for good, as a force for change, as an efficient body that can bring about meaningful change and transform people's lives for the better. And people on the right would, conservative people, minded people, would be a lot more skeptical. They'll sort of, hang on, the government can't do all this. The government is inefficient. The government is full of people who've never been in business, who don't know what they're doing, who are idealistic, and so that's the type of people who are drawn to people who, and this is what I found, that many of the civil servants, I would say young, in many cases, university graduates who'd not really had a quote unquote real job in the private sector before, who come straight from university, people who've been there many years as well, but who'd always been in the same position, and who had, again, certain ideological views. So these people are people who, on the left, who again, uh, because they're on the left, they don't really value the concept of the nation state. They don't consider really in their calculation. We're talking about policy officials about what policy should be prioritized. They don't really concern themselves with the national interest. That term is rarely I've ever heard now. What's the national interest? They would maybe concern themselves with more the public health, with access to healthcare, regardless of the nationality of the recipients. But of course, they are serving a government that is elected by and paid by British taxpayers. So there's a irreconcilable gap there, really, if you think about it, between what the people who are they are accountable to the government who's elected by the people of the United Kingdom, and what they consider their objectives to be, which is far more in terms of, well, what is Britain's international standing? What's our reputation on the international stage? What would be what should we do, regardless of what the British public think? And so this is the problem. And what I witnessed among policy officials in government is how, and you're probably familiar with the series Yes Minister from the 1980s.
Never watched it, but yeah.
Yeah, Nigel Hawthorne and Sir Humphrey Appleby, but I mean, it's very good, and I would encourage you to watch some of the episodes. And what I'd say, very generally speaking, is that the caricatures that you see, and whereas it's kind of fossilized in the 1980s, and it's no longer old men and sort of suits anymore. It's a lot more diverse. In terms of the employees, often the tactics that are used to manipulate ministers haven't really changed. And when a policy official comes up with a new policy idea, then they're supposed to submit this to the minister for approval. And I'm going to outline, some of the tactics they use to ensure that they get that approval, they get that sign off for their policy idea.
Just before you do, just to make sure I'm keeping up here, we're saying that within the civil service, there are policy officials that create policies, and then they take that, and then now you're going to describe how they get it in and how they get it signed off by the ministers, right? To turn it into law or regulations that become law. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to go into some of the way they manipulate it, but I can give you.
Just wanted to check that I'm
yes, you're absolutely on the right page. You're absolutely on the right page. Okay.
Sorry,
I can give you a concrete example of rather, before I go into some of the manipulation tactics that they use. An example of a policy. So within DHSC, there's a policy team, or at least there was when I was there, and I assume it's probably still there. That whose effectively job seemed to be to, every time there was a new health crisis, whether it was COVID or the monkeypox outbreak, also and so forth, to create an exception to the rule that overseas visitors should pay into the NHS. So some years ago, I think 10 years ago, probably earlier than that, there was rules came into force that if you were using the NHS and you were from abroad and you didn't have UK residence, you weren't a British citizen, you didn't have UK residence, you were a visitor from overseas, then you should have to pay towards the NHS. It was actually comes out, I believe it comes out when you pay your fee for visa or right. there exists a policy team that every time there's some health crisis, they create an exception to this rule. So they'll say, yes, well, that's the rule, but this is an exception. So if someone is an overseas visitor, but they believe they got COVID, they can go and get the treatment they need, right, basically, without having to pay. But they would have done lots of other exceptions. So now they're about, or at least the last time I checked, something like 20, 30, 40 exceptions to the rule, such that the policy team is effectively changing the rule by exception slowly over time. This is an example, it's a concrete example of how the rules are undermined in order to put considerations other than the national interest, other than how much public money is being spent on our health service, and who is benefiting from the health service, regardless of whether or not they've paid into it. So obviously all British taxpayers do buy national insurance, but no one who's overseas visitors has paid into the NHS. But I'm going to go into some of the tactics they use. So a policy official, as I was saying, they would come up with a policy idea and they would submit it to the minister for approval. And this is where the manipulation comes in. They would first of all, one of the tactics they use is they create a false dilemma in what's known as a false dilemma in logic terms. They would create two options, typically, for the minister to choose from. So that's already, and it's a false dilemma because it's narrowing down the choices. In fact, the minister can do take whatever decision they want, but by creating two options, they give the illusion that you have to choose A or B.
Well, it's a sales tactic. Yeah, it's a sales tactic.
And option B will be either do nothing or some really absurd thing that the minister's not going to pick. They will then put a preferred option. This is what we think through our expertise. And again, they're using their technical expertise. This is what we recommend that we do. So the policy officials are relying on and they like ministers who are. But ministers are, by this very nature, they're MPs, they're elected MPs, so they've got constituency built business, they've got their media profile to be concerned about, they're busy people, and they don't have the time to read through all the policy details. So they rely on the civil servants to provide that for them. And they also don't want to rock the boat because they're part of the cabinet. So they don't want to create... if they say no and they create, again, this is going to consume a lot of their time, but it's also potentially going to create, headlines. Minister stands in the way of X, Y, Z, and they would have to defend their position. It's not easy for them, right? Then that's one tactic. Then so the policy officials will try to control the options. They will try to control the time. Urgency, because he controls the time, controls the situation. So they will say, well, this is urgent, minister, you have to sign this, because if you don't sign this, then the world's going to fall apart, we're not going to be compliant with some international convention. And this comes on to the next point. They will always think about our international conventions, our international treaties, bilateral, multilateral conventions, whatever we're signed up to as a country, and they will, if that conflicts with national law, they will always put the international convention as the priority, and so that again they're prioritizing the international over the national interest.
Yeah, just to pause on that, just to kind of clarify then. They're putting they're not considering the nation, the people. They're not patriotic in any sense. You're saying that they want to kind of pander to globalist ideas, right? Because that's kind of the way they're ideologically positioned. And would you say like the majority of civil servants are left-leaning, or like, and how much roughly?
Yes.
Ballpark, kind of 80-90% or something like that, yeah?
Again, I don't want to, and I said this previously, I don't want to
No, but just are we saying it's like, Are we saying it's overwhelmingly left, is what we're saying? People can come up with their own number.
Yes, I
Okay.
would say so. I think, if you if the only people who could vote were civil servants, then you would get
Yeah.
you know, a very, very strong Labour landslide, or Greens landslide, or Lib Dem landslide maybe, but a
Yeah.
very strong left-wing majority, put it that way. Um, but going back to sort of what I was talking about, these are the manipulation techniques. These are the sort of techniques, that the pressure points that the civil servants, the policy officials know that they can push to get through their agenda. They will talk about the minister having collective responsibility as a member of the cabinet,
Mm.
or the secretary of state at least, and so and that will frighten the minister, because they're like, well, if you don't sign this, then you're not taking collective, you're not being part of the team, you're not being part of the government. But often the reality is that the consensus is not with the ministers of the other government departments, but with the civil servant bureaucracy in the other departments. So again, it's sleight of hand, it's prestidigitation, it's they're manipulating the situation. And they'll say, oh, well, you have to do this, minister, as well, because the prime minister, or another minister, someone made a commitment on the floor of the House of Commons 2 years ago, whatever it was, and it was recorded in Hansard. Therefore, you're tied to this. You have to then,
Yeah, but is
you
that
have
a
to
lie, or
keep by this commitment.
did that happen though, or are they just saying that?
Yeah, this is one of the techniques. So, well, they wouldn't make that up. But this is something that
Right.
they can. Again, it's not possible for you to change your mind. It's not possible for you to make a different position now. And then, if all else fails, if you get someone who's particularly difficult, as, for example, Priti Patel, and particularly Suella Braverman actually was, as Home Secretary, who really stood up and particularly pushed back on the whole DEI and woke agenda.
Mm.
And she wrote a very sort of scathing article in the Daily Mail back in 2021 or whatever it was, when she was Home Secretary. She might have been Attorney General at the time, I can't remember.
Mm.
And that she wrote, I think she was Attorney General, but she wrote a very scathing, really talking about the whole nature of DEI and how she was really pushing back against it. And when ministers really do push back, then they get accused by the civil servants of bullying,
Mm.
because if you push back against us, if you say no, you're bullying us. And of course, the media, being the media, the legacy media, what side it takes, how it presents the story. It will present the ministers being in the wrong as to being the bullying party.
Mm.
And so this is, again, the racket, and the establishment coming together, the media class coming together with the civil service technocratic class to overrule the decisions, the position of the elected government of the day.
Can I just actually just on that, right? Can we just pause? So I want to just flash up a quick video. Dominic Cummings, the former chief advisor to the Prime
Yeah,
Minister, right?
And it's part of like how the whole system has become fake. So you have fake meritocracy, fake responsibility, and then fake cabinet government. So they all walk up Downing Street, the cameras whir, they pose, they smile, ha ha, I'm going into the most powerful meeting, aren't I great? But it's all nonsense. The cabinet is just a kind of stage theatre. And actually officials in the cabinet office have already decided it all. When you sit in Whitehall now, right, in meetings, they are literally scripted. So when the Prime Minister has a meeting with ministers, what happens is that before the Prime Minister has that meeting, officials go into the Prime Minister's study and they give him a folder. And in the folder at the front is a thing called Chairman's Notes. And that's the script. And that's what the Prime Minister reads out. And the conclusions for the meeting are in the Chairman's Notes, drafted before the meeting happens, right? So the Prime Minister says, hello, Secretary of State, blah, blah, blah. And then all these officials sit around the sides on chairs around the edge of the room. And then the MP, the Secretaries of State, all look down at their folders because they've all got their scripts, right? And this is why I use the NPC meme, right? Because then the Prime Minister reads out, well, we're here to discuss blah, blah, blah. And then he goes around the room, and then Secretary of State for Justice or the Foreign Secretary reads out his bullet points, and then he reads out their bullet points. And they read out. If anyone goes on script, you see the officials sort of go, And I look over at the other official inside the room and kind of go, that means we'll come back to that after the meeting and make sure that that doesn't happen. And then at the end, it was a fascinating, great discussion. Thank you so much for your wonderful, insightful, original contributions. And then he reads out the conclusions, which are all drafted in advance. And it sounds like a parody, but it is literally how the British state functions.
Dominic Cummings is interesting because he is a maverick, and he was very, comfortable in that skin. That's how he presented himself. He would just non-conformably with his, baseball cap and his t-shirt, and he just didn't, he spoke about actually, wanting weirdos and misfits to apply for civil service jobs, and that maybe wasn't the best language, but the principle was good. That actually you should get, rather than getting the same type of identikit university graduate left-wing type who all think the same thing, groupthink. If you're familiar with that term, they all think on the same page and all follow the same script, and to actually get people to join who have skills that can improve efficiency. This is very much what Elon Musk has done with Doge, Department of Government Efficiency in the US.
Okay, so all right, so if we could bring it back maybe to, because you've got a good foundation of how it's manipulated. So can we now go back into COVID again and just
Yes,
talk about
absolutely.
how, what you saw going on and how you felt uncomfortable with it, and if there was,
Yeah.
so certain envelopes, or how's it work then? Certain things were coming across your desk, was it? And then you had to coordinate it. So you were seeing things like the social distancing, the mask mandates, the kind of the fines and all that
Yeah.
for people
Well,
if they were
I had sight of all the regulations,
right.
because all the regulations came through my team, because we were part of we were the team basically coordinating all the departmental
Sure.
legislation. So we had sight of all of it. And that, I would be, part of my job, I would be reading through and checking the something called explanatory memoranda, which basically documents that are laid alongside the law, which are meant to explain, often fail to do so, but are meant to explain what the legislation does to the public. And I would be sort of reading, proofread, checking them, and so I was, very much aware of all the legislation that was going through, and as I said, I felt maybe not immediately. I'm afraid to say that, I, like a lot of people initially, when COVID came along, I kind of went along with it. I'm afraid to say, I had that sort of trust. I was sort of, well, maybe there is a pandemic, maybe there is urgency here, maybe this is really serious. And I know undoubtedly COVID exists, but the point was, were the government measures proportional, response proportional? Was the, I mean, we know that, there's a branch of the military called the 77th Brigade who were involved in psychological warfare, who were involved in psychological. They were deployed in the COVID response to basically, they were involved in all the advertising and the messaging to terrify the living daylights out of the public into cooperating. And so when you had the messaging, wear your mask, otherwise you're going to kill granny, and all this sort of stuff. And I was, again, it wasn't involved in the policy, but I was seeing all this stuff being pushed through. I had great concerns with the legislative processes that I've already explained why and how they were being pushed through without any parliamentary scrutiny, and without, again, those elected MPs having sight and reviewing them. In fact, it wasn't just me. There was Delegated Legislation and Regulatory Oversight Committee, which I think is a Lords Committee, and they wrote a long report, and they were very critical of the government for having overused this particular legislative process that I was referring to, that emergency.
Mm.
In fact, there was a barrister who I met at a later stage. So now I'm trying to remember now, but he brought something called a judicial review, which is basically when someone can challenge, if you can challenge a decision of if you're granted leave by a high court, you can challenge the decision of a public authority. There's a barrister who brought this judicial review. It wasn't successful on this very basis that the government during the COVID period had been overusing this legislative procedure to push through all this legislation without democratic oversight, scrutiny. But what the UK government did do was very easily identify what it saw as a very important problem, and I'll go into why it would have seen COVID as a very important problem, and to highlight that and to focus very heavily on that, and then identify and then create a reaction to that problem by focusing on it, and creating this public panic, and therefore creating the public demand for rules to be imposed. This is the solution.
Yeah. Problem, right? Reaction, solution.
Problem, reaction, solution. Okay. Exactly.
All right. So basically what we've got here, just to summarize, so basically we've got the COVID committee, who was made up of, I don't think I quite asked that, but it was people like Whitty, was it? And some other people like that. Hancock, I don't know if Hancock's in there or not. Is he?
Yes. So Matt Hancock was the Secretary of State for Health. Right. When I first joined the DHSC, throughout the early part of COVID.
And how many are in that COVID committee? Just roughly.
I couldn't tell you an exact. I couldn't.
5 people, 50 people, 500.
No, it would have been It would have been a small group. It would have been like a small group, like handful. Maybe 10 people.
10 people, so whatever. Okay.
Something like that.
Right. Okay. And those people are themselves ministers, are they, or not?
Yes. So you would have the Prime Minister there. You would have had the. You would have had those. The chief medical officer and the chief scientific officer and anyone like that. They're not elected officials. They are government employees. So they are right. So they would have had a whole team behind them and their own department.
So some are civil servants, some are government employees, some are civil servants.
Yes, exactly. So they're very senior. Yes, very senior.
All right. Let me just say. Okay. So you've got that COVID committee now. They were able to bypass Parliament's scrutiny by working with a Public Health Act 1984, which is a way to use the idea of a crisis and emergency procedure, which means that there's an immediate bypass for democratic, parliamentary procedure, right? And so that's how it gets in.
My contention is that they were overusing, and not just my contention, but the contention of the regulatory oversight committee that I mentioned earlier, that were scrutinizing what government was doing at the time and their report. But their contention is that yes, that they overused that legislation when they're making COVID rules in order to be able to make these rules as quickly as possible. As quickly
as possible. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So then where we're up to then is this was being pushed as well onto the public, and it was coming from places like the 77th Brigade and probably SAGE as well, and some other think tanks, right?
Sure. I mean, so sometimes it sounds like it's a made-up term, but it is an actual branch of the military, of the armed forces, and it was, actively involved. That's not something I was involved in at all, but it's something that I'm sure the MOD would have been, the Ministry of Defence would have been involved with. That was certainly involved in the effort, if you like.
Okay. I'm just I'm just paraphrasing. So I'm just
Yeah,
you don't have
sure,
to
sure,
stay. We don't have to stick on this. I'm just trying to like stay
sure,
up to date.
sure.
So the 77th Brigade, I think they were also responsible for checking people's social media to see if they were going against the narrative. I could be wrong, but I think I saw that as well. Then you got SAGE. SAGE were the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies. I think they were also responsible for not infiltrating, but like how should we say,
Yes, they would. They
influencing. They
would.
were influencing the
Yes,
civil servants, right, and the
yes, absolutely.
committee.
Yeah, yeah.
And probably if you looked into Sage, there's probably going to be ties to Bill Gates as well. I don't know, but there's probably going to be some connection to that Gavi, whatever, right? Okay, and so then from all that, it got pushed via yourself, right? And so it came and you saw some of these regulations, and you were what was your role then? Was your role to kind of sign it off or what?
No, 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 no.
No,
I want to stress this. I was not a decision maker.
no,
I
okay.
was simply a cog in the machine. My position, to clarify,
Mm,
and that of my team, because I was working in a team,
mm,
working to coordinate this. So, say you had the right policy officials, and they would come up with their policy, and then
mm,
they would liaise often themselves with the drafting lawyers.
mhm,
But sometimes we would coordinate with them, the drafting lawyers as well. And then, but we would contact the our team would then contact the parliamentary officials, the laying officers in Parliament, and say, "Hello, we've got this legislation. It's going to be, it needs to come into. We're going to be laying it in Parliament today or tomorrow or whenever. Heads up, this is coming your way. So please ensure that this is." That you accept this that we're sending you, and then there was another party called the regulation registrar, which is the National Archives. So they have
mm,
to register all legislation. So we had to coordinate with them, and then there was the cabinet office who had oversight generally of the legislation. So we were basically, and then there's within the department. The regulations had to be signed by the minister. So we were in touch with the what's known as the private office, which is the body of civil servants within the department, directly supporting the minister to ensure that the minister would be available to sign the legislation when it needed to be signed, right?
mm.
So we were basically coordinating to ensure that that legislation could be made on time when it needed to be. So I wasn't making any decisions. I was putting heads together. I was
Connecting the dots, yeah, like you
yes,
were making it all
connecting the
like
dots.
streamlined so that
Exactly.
the policies could reach the
Yes,
ministers.
I was
Okay,
connecting together the different
yeah.
parts of the
All
machine.
right, so let's talk about that then. So can we have another example of, let's say, something that made you feel uncomfortable and that made you go, oh, like I don't like this, and
Well, generally speaking,
mm,
I mean, I remember that. I remember in December 2020, and we were
mm,
going to go into another lockdown. This was an informal term used by the public, but effectively putting the new tiers restrictions at the time as the formal way of putting. Essentially, what it meant was, and this was, Boris made this announcement. He was then prime minister. He made this announcement like a few days before Christmas. I think it was like the 20th or 21st of December 2020, and he so literally, you know, and he made this announcement, and he put the country down into uh, lockdown to create new tiers restrictions, and what that meant was that people within one tier could not travel to visit people in another tier area. Effectively, what that meant was that probably millions of people across the country who had made plans to go and visit their relatives in a different part of the country for
mm,
Christmas had to cancel those plans at the last minute. And I
right.
remember reading this, understanding the implications of this, and completely breaking down emotionally in tears at what I was and I had to be part of doing. And I I realized that I was in the wrong role, that it was completely personally conflicted. And this was that was one of the first, but it well, from bad to worse, and I felt very uncomfortable with a lot of it, and I could try and tell myself, well, look, I'm not the decision maker. I'm just part of a machine here, but at the same time, what am I? Am I just obeying orders? You know, it's I really grappled with myself, and then I'm going to come on to this now. So this was around March 2021. I was, without any warning, I was suspended by the government department, the agency where I worked. I was suspended and investigated, and this was nothing to do, and it was clear than what they told me, ostensibly at least. It had nothing to do with my performance at work, because despite all my own personal reservations, I was getting on with the job I was doing professionally, and in fact they said as much. They suspended me because, at least this is the official reason, this is what was pursued. I personally think that that my line manager had, despite my neutrality and despite my professionalism, had picked up that I had some concerns and reservations on the policy, and that may have been the real reason behind my suspension. But I was suspended and investigated for things that I had commented on like 5, 6, 7 years before I'd been employed. And they basically, because I had been a political candidate and I had expressed opinions, and they said, oh, the fact that I had expressed those opinions breaches our departmental policy. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. You can't apply your policies retroactively against me for something that I did years before I was employed by you. And I fought it, and it was very traumatic. But I was then reinstated, and eventually I got an apology. I went through the internal grievance process in the department and said, well, this is ridiculous what you did to me. And to complicate matters, I was very physically unwell around this time as well. But and this is sort of delayed a lot of stuff. But eventually, I brought a employment tribunal claim against the department, and I went to the employment tribunal with it, and then it didn't actually get anywhere in the end, but I pursued it quite far, and I certainly challenged how they were treating me, which I considered to be completely egregious. But this comes back to what happened to me essentially is something I was talking about with you before, when I was going through DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion, and this cancel culture is what I consider to be the left's modus operandi for trying to eliminate people within the system, within organizations who are quote unquote problematic. And so I refer to cancel culture as DEI by negation, because you're trying to DEI is concerned with hiring people who have the quote unquote right views and the right groupthink, who kowtow to the woke mindset, and who are going to promote those quote unquote progressive ideas.
Yeah.
But equally, it can identify people who they say, well, you're not playing ball, you're thinking independently, you don't have the right views, and then the way they frame it, they obviously you don't fit in with our values or whatever.
So do you think that's what happened then? So basically in March 2021, that is when they what's the terminology? They
suspended me.
They just suspended you. Okay, so in March 2021 they tried to suspend you, and then you challenged it, and you believe this is because your views, your opinions are not of the Marxist cult, or whatever you want to call it. We can dress it up, say it however you want, but basically that's the kind of the thing, right? You're not part of the progressive gang. And so they went back into your past. They found what social media post, something like that, and they said, "Oh, no,
Yeah,
that's a little bit slightly right of, what we're used to. We need to purge this
yeah.
of our."
In fact, that
Yeah.
in fact that was one of the accusations against me. I think they found something, and literally they said, "Oh, this is a critique." I wrote an article or something. They literally their argument was, "Oh, this is from a right of center viewpoint," and I was like, "Well, I wrote this like about free speech and I wrote about like on social media, and I wrote this like years ago, and
And
this
what's
is
wrong with right of center anyway?
exactly,
Yeah, all right.
exactly,
You
exactly."
probably just said there was like more than two gender. Oh, sorry, that you probably just
Well,
said there was only two genders, and then
some
that
of the stuff, some of the
meltdown.
stuff that I said was critical, and maybe I used some colorful
Yeah.
language
Okay.
describing the the excesses of feminist activists,
Hmm.
and maybe I expressed some concerns about of trans ideology,
Right.
about trans activists, and how they go about bullying people into submitting to their
And they
and I
did,
think,
and they
you
did, and
know,
that's the ultimate irony because they did come down on you for that. So okay, so but do you think it was because of that, or do you think it was more down to the fact that they could start to feel as though you had some reservations around the COVID legislation being pushed, and and all that? Was it both, or do you think deep down it was actually your pushback
well,
against that?
this is the $1 billion question, really, and the answer is I don't know.
Right.
And to be honest with you, it may have been a combination of the
Yeah.
two,
Okay.
but certainly I don't rule out either or. And but I
What's your
yeah.
gut though? What's your gut instinct?
Well, I think maybe it started off that there's effectively a feminist lawyer with the GLD who was supporting the government department who looked me up and found that my views were intolerable because they diverged from her own. Um, and then maybe when they then took into account maybe some comments that I had made that I felt I had thought were one on one with my line manager, but have used against me. And I I
Doesn't matter.
feel
We don't have to go too much into the details.
yeah, no, and I don't want
Just
to.
gut
But what I
instinct.
will
Yeah.
say
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
broadly speaking is that I felt that I was treated incredibly unfairly,
Mm.
and I think that. And I think it's just underscored the groupthink and the everything that I already had suspected by that point of being true, that, and this just confirmed all of it, the scale of cancel culture, the scale of the woke progressive long march through the institutions, and
Mm.
systemic takeover, and the intolerance um, of critical of views that don't comply. So I sat in on a policy official meeting once, and this was in DHSC, and they were talking about um, actually something completely unrelated to the comment that I overheard, but it really stuck with me, and I just remembered it, and I thought it would be worth highlighting. And it was off the cuff remark made by a civil servant. Um, they weren't talking about education policy. It was health policy, but they made a comment so far as everybody wants to get into decolonization. Everyone wants to get into decolonization policy, right, relating to education, and that really struck with me because I was just sitting in on this meeting. First of all, so I wasn't really participating. I immediately, well, no, does everybody want to get into decolonization policy? Well, maybe you do. Maybe that's your ideal. Maybe that's your dream. But it was impossible for me to say anything there in disagreement or to question what they meant. Because if I had sort of questioned, well, what do you mean by decolonization? and started to make, I might have been effectively blacklisted. They were like, oh, he's problematic, right? Um, uh, just so you have to sort of stay silent. Um, that's one example
What did they
of
mean then about that decolonization? Like, what did they mean by that?
well, that's a very good question because, of course, decolonization doesn't mean that Britain doesn't have colonies anymore. You know, it has a few overseas British territories, maybe one less now that Keir Starmer has completely disgracefully sold the well, is paying for the privilege of getting rid of our territory, the Chagos Islands, completely against the views of the Chagos Islanders, by the way, and like giving it to Mauritius and paying Mauritius like £10 billion or whatever it is with interest adjusted, like for the privilege of giving away our sovereign territory, which has a naval base, strategic naval base in the middle of the Indian Ocean there. So basically, but we don't have colonies. So what do they mean by decolonization? Well, actually, what they mean is going to museums or education system in the UK and about rewriting our history, or and just basically creating lies in many cases, basically saying, changing historical textbooks to say that, I don't know, Black African people were involved in building Stonehenge and that kind of thing. And just like that's what they mean by quote unquote decolonization. And so I think, that's what they mean, because the civil servants are coming up with policy affecting the UK internally within the UK. So, unless you're talking about the Foreign Office, but so, I mean, that's one example of wokeness. Another example was during the whole George Floyd. And by the way, at that point, I was in DEFRA rather than DHSC, but I remember the time the flood of emails about the reaction that you would think this was the murder of or the death by fentanyl poisoning, whichever perspective you take of this.
Yeah, he died of an overdose. I think anyone with their brain screwed on, their head screwed on, knows that. Yeah, it was a fentanyl overdose.
Okay, but I would agree. But I mean, for the purposes of just accepting that certain people have different views on that, but it happened regardless. It happened 4,000 miles away in the US, and yet the reaction to that here in the UK, the protests that took place. By the way, protests that were allowed to take place, breaching the COVID regulations.
Oh yeah, that pissed me off. I remember doing videos on that saying,
yes,
how dare they allow protests for George
yes,
when we can't see our own dying grandma in hospital? That really pissed me off, mate. I remember doing a video on that, and I was so livid about that. All for some twat fentanyl overdose. Yeah, anyway, I'm getting angry just thinking about it.
So the complete hypocrisy and the complete, their double standards. But just the fact that there was a response at all in the UK, and what was something that happened in the US. And I just remember the onslaught of emails from the department, who was almost like within the civil, who were almost panicking that they had to respond, that they had to say something, that we're going to now fight for restorative justice or whatever, or reparations or whatever it was. And like we have to take, all this DEI stuff so much more seriously because of this oppression. And
it's basically you basically had two psyops against each other. It was like the psyop of COVID or the psyop of George Floyd, and this sort of like racism against black people. And it was like, which one's going to win? And in the end, they just we'll just kind of let the George Floyd protests happen. And then they even said, I don't know if you remember this, they even said you can't catch COVID at a George Floyd protest. That should have been the moment where everyone went, hang on a minute, this is all bullshit. But it didn't. It's like they just. Then when there was a Trump rally, they said you're more likely to catch COVID at a Trump rally, and still that didn't wake up anyone.
Well, the whole Boris cake eating gate fiasco thing was ridiculous in the same vein, because obviously, but it's not ridiculous for the reasons that that many of the leftists would say. They'd say, "Ah, well, he breached the COVID rules." Yes, but what the point is much deeper than that. The point is, of course, that he breached them despite being the prime minister who was making those decisions, ultimately responsible to the prime minister, but with the COVID committee that I mentioned, he was making these decisions. Yet the point was that he clearly didn't consider COVID to be so much of a threat, despite having access to all that information as the prime minister. Because if he had really believed that COVID was a threat, he wouldn't have breached the rules, would he? And that was the real takeaway. That was the real point. And it's the one that the media, repeatedly refused to cover that angle. They refused to cover it. They were like, "Oh, well, Boris has breached the rules."
Yeah, he knew it was bullshit. He knew it was harmless.
The point was he knew it was bullshit, as you say.
Partygate.
That was the reality of it.
Yeah, Partygate.
But going back to the civil service, the fact that the civil service would start panicking that they weren't doing enough was almost that they were using this as an excuse for their progressive virtue signaling, or whatever it is, the progressive victimhood mentality, their progressive viewpoint. That and then I just remember these insane emails, and that they would have like the whole department copied in, like literally the whole department copied into these communiques that would just basically tell everybody that, okay, we've got to take all this anti-racism, diversity stuff this much more seriously because of George Floyd. And then one of the employees would reply back, copying in everybody, saying, "Oh, you're just paying lip service to it. You need to do, you're not really helping us, oppress people, minorities. In reality, are you?" And it just became ridiculous. And there'll be these chains of emails, and of course, off the back of it, there was all this more DEI, diversity training, and all that pushed. But the reason I mention this as well is I know someone who worked for another civil servant. He worked for the Office for National Statistics, the ONS, which is another. Well, I think it's not a. It's part of the civil service. It's not a government department, but it's quasi autonomous. But it's part of the public, bureaucracy, and the ONS sort of the people who, by the way, do the census every 10 years. Who organise that, but they also, crunch statistics and numbers for the government. And he was a statistician, and he worked for them, and he was copied into one of these emails in the ONS about, in the George Floyd, and was told, well, he was copied in together with the whole department, and was told, you need to undertake this training. And he replied to all. He replied back very bravely, very courageously. He replied back to everyone and said, "No, I don't think this is right. I don't think it's right that I should have to undergo this indoctrination," which is what it is, and this supposed training, and I object to doing this. And for that, he was dismissed, and he then brought his own employment tribunal claim on that. So I just wanted to mention that, because this was another example of how dissenters are identified, and for cancellation, for dismissal. And when I said I was suspended, in terms of disciplinary process, suspension is the first step towards dismissal. So you have to be suspended and then investigated, given a hearing, and then if found against you, you can be dismissed. But so that's another good example. And I'm going to give you another something that I observed was, again, this was when I was actually in DEFRA, and the civil servants, like sort of many corporate employers, now organize these things called away days. these sort of team building away days where you go together with sometimes they're just laughed off as a bit of a jolly, but you go to I don't know, a conference room somewhere nice, and you do all these team building exercises where you do all these the score.
Yeah.
And so I went on this away day with the directorate within DEFRA that where I was working, which is at the time was Constitutional and Borders Directorate. And our away day was at the Oval Cricket Ground. And we were all in this massive conference room there. And it was a huge department at the time. There's a lot of work being undertaken. There must have been 100 or so, at least 100 more people there. And in front of this room, I just remember this very vividly, in front of this room, this was all while we're pre-COVID, BC, in other words, before COVID, yes. There's a DEFRA, so it was all taking place physically. And so we were all in this massive conference room there, and the director of the directorate, in other words, the senior civil servant in charge of them, stood up and he gave a speech. And bearing in mind that the permanent secretary of the department, who's the top of the chief civil servant, was also there. And he gave a speech and he really went off on the Tory ministers. And this was about Brexit. And he went off on a rant about how the Conservative ministers they all love Brexit, blah, blah, blah. And they all want deregulation. They all want to deregulate and to take overregulation off the EU overregulation of the UK statute book and make laws simpler to help businesses or whatever. But those bloody Tory ministers, they can never identify exactly what they want deregulated. And he went on this long rant about it. And it's a great shame I never recorded it, because it was egregious example of the civil servant in flagrantly in full display, open display, in front of 100 people department. And this was the senior civil servant speaking, completely undermining like the neutrality and the impartiality the civil servant's supposed to have. Right? He wasn't even making a pretense at being impartial there. He was putting out his views very decisively, and so this is another example again of the
they get away with it, don't they? That's the thing. Like if you've got left-wing views, it's allowed. If you've got right-wing views, you're immediately like dismissed.
Yeah, I mean and I would say that broadly that the civil service that people are professional. They're carrying out a job. You may criticize them for not necessarily having. Some people criticize civil service for not having the work ethic of people in the private sector, and that may be a fair summation. But people are doing their job. They're being professional and they are abiding by rules generally. But it's the attitudes, it's the language that people use, it's what you overhear. It's, for example, when I was working in DHSC. Anyone who was skeptical about, the word anti-vaxxers was used a lot among civil servants in a pejorative sense. People who are skeptical about. So it's the language, it's the attitudes, it's the general atmosphere, and what you can say, and when you have to shut up and just keep your mouth closed and your lips sealed, because otherwise, you'll get into hot waters. I guess for me, my personal journey there was very dark, and in terms of what I underwent and the depression I would call it traumatic. What I experienced was traumatic in terms of, first of all, my involvement in the process and feeling completely conflicted with that. In fact, being almost on the point thinking about whether I should resign or not from my position, and then that being overtaken by my suspension, and then being on the defensive end of something that was ostensibly unrelated to that. And so it was almost psychological games that the civil service were playing on me, whether intentionally or not, but it was certainly, I was at the receiving end of all of that. And so I went through enormous traumatic experience throughout that process. And then obviously, because I had effectively a career there. I'd been promoted, and I was going somewhere, and I left all of that, and I was effectively, in the end, I mean, the ultimate. I don't want to go too much into my employment, but in the end, I resigned at the end of 2022. I stepped down from it all myself. By that time, I had undergone 2 suspensions. I had undergone 2 serious, unrelated, but physical operations, surgery in hospital, and I was really very much at breaking point, and I resigned, and then I was back at square one, and I sort of had to revert to what I was doing before I joined the civil service in the first place, and it kind of it scarred. It's a scar on my life, and so I don't want to, and I'm because I'm not the victim here, and the population of the victim, but I feel that this is a story that has to be told. It's one of
course.
So many stories at the time of so many people who were impacted by that, and I think I will never go back and work for government again.